So what is the Bible? If you had to just say, what is the Bible? Tell someone, tell a neighbor who's never read it, what is it? What would you say? I think a very common answer is that the Bible is a rule book for living. A rule book for living. A book of guidelines. And I would say that that's true, but it doesn't go nearly far enough, and it sort of would mischaracterize the Bible. The Bible, most of all, is a storybook. It's a storybook about who God is and who we are. What do we have to do with each other? And rules and guidelines become very much a part of that, but only when they're understood as part of the story, part of this connection between the one who gave us this life and the one who calls us to make something of it. So the Bible is first and foremost a storybook, and it has a plot. And we've been seeing evidence of this plot that sort of repeats itself all through the Scriptures. We saw it in Abraham, where Abraham and Sarah were chosen by God, but chosen for a purpose. They were blessed in order to be a blessing. Then last week we saw how, in the story of the Exodus, how God saved his people from slavery in Egypt. He heard their cries. He would not let them remain in bondage. He brought them out of Egypt. He blessed them. But now here we read the second half of that story as the people have wandered through the wilderness and come to Mount Sinai, where Moses first heard the voice of God calling to him from a burning bush. And now they'll receive the 10 Commandments. Blessed, but why? Blessed in order to be a blessing. Blessed in order to be God's covenant people. So now it's time for the people to respond and become part of the covenant. God has made an offer to them. His part of the covenant. And covenant is the Bible word for promise. God promises to be there for his people. And now he asks the people to respond to the promise of their own. To respond to this offer of a relationship, of an ongoing and everlasting relationship between God and his people. God said, these here in the 10 Commandments, these are the parameters. This is your part of the covenant. And so we hear now the second part of that biblical pattern that goes from liberation to obligation, from grace to demand, from gospel to law. And so I invite you now to hear about this very personal contract that the God of all things is making with the people of Israel there at Mount Sinai. Hear the word of God. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. For the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. When all the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, they were afraid and trembled and stood at a distance. And said to Moses, you speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid, for God has come only to test you and to put the fear of him upon you, so that you do not sin. Then the people stood at a distance, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Pray with me. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. You who are our rock and our redeemer. Amen. So 35 years ago, a movie came out, unlike any other, that captured the imagination of folks. No, not Star Wars. That was a little before. Raiders of the Lost Ark. A new hero, a whole new genre of action-adventure films, and a whole new appreciation for something rather remarkable. You've seen the movie, right? I think even kids see the movie today, don't they? It holds up pretty well. You have Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones, the archaeologist. You have him chasing Nazis. You have all this stuff, but most of all, he was chasing the Ark of the Covenant, which contains, perhaps, whatever is left of the Ten Commandments. The Nazis are after it. And so because the Nazis are after it, Harrison Ford and the Americans and the Brits are after it too. Because who knows? Just maybe, as Indiana Jones says, it has the power of God. And so through all kinds of adventures, they're following. It's an amazing movie. It's a lot of fun. But at the very end, I remember being incredibly amazed that this Hollywood film took the power of God seriously. Took the power of God seriously. If you remember at the end, am I spoiling it for anyone? Now, at the end, when they open the ark, all that's in there is dust. All that's left of the Ten Commandments have turned to dust. And yet, there's a power there. And not a very pleasant power, as the Nazis discover. But nonetheless, this movie, with all its Hollywood craziness, took the power of God seriously. I walked out of the movie theater stunned. Stunned. I thought it'd just be an archaeology movie. No. The movie said, just maybe there is more to holiness than even back in the 1980s, even more than our society thinks that there is. The power of God. So the question today, as we've read the story of the Ten Commandments, is there power in these words that we've read? Is there any, maybe not the power of spirits, as you remember the movie, all kinds of spirits floating out of the dust of the Ten Commandments. Not the power of spirits, but is there a spiritual power left in the Ten Commandments? And the answer, of course, is yes. Yes, there is spiritual power in the Ten Commandments. Why is that? Well, because we are more than just biological, chemical creatures. Teilhard de Chardin, the French paleontologist who also had great spiritual appreciation, he said, we are not just human beings having a physical experience. We are spiritual beings having a physical experience. We are spiritual beings having a physical experience. And so, yes, it matters. As spiritual beings, our spirits are shaped by what we do, by the choices we make. Our experience as spiritual beings is shaped by what we do. So yes, there's power in the Ten Commandments because yes, we are called to live a certain kind of life, not just for its own sake, but because that is what shapes our spirit. Is there spiritual power in the Ten Commandments and these rules that have been given to us? Yes. Because we want to be held accountable for our lives. We want our lives to matter. In the Presbyterian Church, to be ordained as a minister of Word and Sacrament, you have to go to seminary, 3 years of graduate school. You have to pass ordination exams. You have to be queried along the way by the Presbytery Committee. But at the very end of the process, the very last thing, you stand before a group as big or bigger than this one of pastors and elders. And you say what you believe, you read a statement of your beliefs, and then they can ask you anything they want about anything. It puts great fear and trepidation in the candidate. Well, I have a friend, Julie, who went through all that process, had prepared mightily, was there before the presbytery. The young man who went before her was grilled about his beliefs, staggered through, survived, was approved. It was her turn. She stood there, she read her statement of faith, she faced the crowd, ready to answer any question that they might ask. All these years of preparation behind her, and stood there, and stood there, and stood there. No one asked her a single question. So they ended the examination, they voted her in, she sat down furious. Furious. No one had asked her a question. No one had held her accountable for all that she had done. And then the man next to her leaned over and said, "You were just so beautiful up there, we couldn't ask you a question." And she punched him. She didn't punch him. But she said she wanted to. Because she wanted to be held accountable. She knew that there were standards that had been set for the profession that she had chosen, and she wanted to be held accountable for all the work she had done to meet those standards. We want to be held accountable. We want our lives to matter. We want it to matter, the kind of life we choose, the actions, the words that we choose. And the Ten Commandments are the beginning of the biblical law that holds us accountable. You may have noticed at the end there, Moses says, "Don't be afraid. God is giving you this so that you do not sin." You're going to be held accountable for these standards. And deep down, we want that. We want that, again, because we are spiritual beings having a physical experience. Do these words have spiritual power? The Ten Commandments, do they have spiritual power? They do, because they are the beginning of that biblical witness, that biblical command of the kind of people we are to be. It starts with the Ten Commandments. Many thou shalt nots, you notice, the things we shouldn't do. But what about the things we should do? Well, the rest of the Bible fills those out pretty well. You know, the prophets, all kinds of ways we should treat one another, especially the widow and the orphan and the stranger. And orphans in those days weren't parentless children, they were fatherless children. Orphan, when the Bible says orphan, it means a child without a father, because the fathers were the ones who provided for their wives, for their children. And without them, without a father, a child was at risk. So over and over, the prophets call us to be responsible for the widow, the orphan, and the alien, the stranger, the immigrant, legal or otherwise, among us. So there's that call. And then, of course, Leviticus, in the midst of all these rules, it says that line that Jesus would quote centuries later, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And then Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, so many other places, calling us not only what we shouldn't do, but what we should do. To love our neighbor, to forgive, to return no one evil for evil. For if you only love those who love you, everybody does that, Jesus says. So the Ten Commandments, spiritual power, yes, because they are calling us to act in a certain way, to become a certain kind of a person, a certain kind of a human being, a certain kind of a spiritual being who's having a physical experience. So there's one more reason, and I want to go back to the first commandment. The first commandment, you would think it would be the most important, wouldn't you? It's number one. It is. "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me." You shall have no other gods before me. That seems sort of obvious, doesn't it? I mean, we're all monotheists these days. There's only one God. We don't have any other God. Or do we? Or do we? I want to read a little bit to you from a commencement exam But if you go online, you can find the full commencement exam from David Foster Wallace, who is a novelist, a postmodern novelist, an award-winning, best-selling postmodern novelist, who sadly took his own life just a few years after this speech. For reasons who knows why, but perhaps connected to what he speaks of. Anyway, he's speaking at Kenyon College in Ohio, graduation, and he says this. He says, there is no such thing as not worshiping. There is no such thing as not worshiping. He was not a particularly religious person from what I can read. But he says there is no such thing as not worshiping. He said out there in the ditches of everyday life, he said there's no such thing as an atheist. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power, and you will feel weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to keep that fear at bay. Worship your intellect and being seen as smart. You will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out, and so on. And he says this, listen carefully to this. Look, the insidious things about these forms of worship is not that they're evil or sinful, it is that they are unconscious. They are default settings. They're the kind of worship you just gradually slip into day after day without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. And then later Wallace says that this unconsciousness, this default setting, is the constant gnawing sense of having had and lost some infinite thing. The constant gnawing sense of having had but lost some infinite thing. How many people are walking through this world aware in some sense they're spiritual beings having a physical existence, but they're spiritual beings who somehow lost the grasp that that's who they are. This is me talking now. We think that these 10 commandments, all the words of the prophets and the words of Jesus that lead us to make these choices and become a particular kind of person, to do certain things and not do other things, we think that these commandments take away our freedom. They limit us. We don't like that, especially as American individualists. We don't like to be limited. We think these commandments take away our freedom. But what they do when we follow them is that they take away our illusions about what really matters. They strip away our false conceptions about who we are, who we really are as spiritual beings. And we realize when we follow them that trusting God is the only center, the only core that works. Here's David Foster Wallace again. There are all different kinds of freedom. And the kind that is most precious you will not hear much about in the great outside world of winning and achieving and displaying. The really important kind of freedom involves paying attention and awareness and discipline and effort and being able to truly care about other people and to sacrifice for them over and over in myriad, petty, little, unsexy ways every day. That is real freedom. You shall have no other gods before me. That is the first commandment. And it is not for gods So whom do you worship? It seems like an easy question, but warning. What's our default setting? What's our unconscious setting? What is it that our words and our deeds would say that we worship? Who is it that we worship? That's the question to ask today. What is it that motivates our deepest desires, our most true words, our most genuine deeds? What is it that motivates them? Who is it? Who is it that motivates them? Take a little time this afternoon and think about that. Do you have the sense, maybe, that you've had and lost something infinite? Who do you worship? It makes all the difference. Pray with me. Lord, you call us to have no other gods but you. Open our eyes as we look in the mirror. For Christ's sake, the world's sake, and our own sakes, we ask. Amen. Let's worship God with our gifts and with